Before you jump to the conclusion that I don't recognize that horrible things have happened to people, let me just say, I am well aware of the realities and aftermath of trauma. My whole professional life is about helping people unravel the ways that acute or chronic, overwhelming past experiences are still affecting their current life. Hey everybody, my name is Leah Benson, and I'm a licensed psychotherapist, coach, and psychedelic guide in Tampa Bay. And to be clear, my perspective on trauma comes from my own decade of psychotherapy and over 2 decades of helping people be able to enjoy their lives despite the horrible things that have happened in their past. Or even not so horrible things. And today, I'm going to tell you why the current trauma narrative is terrible, with one exception. Let's start with some terms you might have seen. PTSD, CPTSD, childhood trauma, acute trauma, developmental trauma, and psychological trauma. Rather than put you to sleep with a bunch of jargon, I'll just briefly summarize each of these terms in language that makes sense in real life. PTSD. You had something terrible happen to you or around you, and no one was there to help you make sense of it and put it into perspective. So anytime anything reminds you of that terrible thing, you automatically feel and behave and have the energy level like you did at the time of that experience, even though that experience isn't happening in your current life. CPTSD. Your whole life was full of experiences that felt overwhelming, and not only was no one there to help you make sense of them, often it was the very people who should have been helping you understand life that made you feel overwhelmed and terrible. This makes you unable to manage your feelings very well, makes you think terrible things about yourself, and makes you pretty poor at managing interpersonal relationships or trusting people. Basically, CPTSD is a newfangled, less stigmatizing way to say that someone is anything from highly neurotic to borderline or personality disordered. Childhood trauma. You felt overwhelmed, helpless, or afraid, physically or mentally as a child. Acute trauma. One instance of feeling overwhelmed, helpless, or afraid, physically or mentally. Developmental trauma. As a child, you felt overwhelmed, helpless, or afraid, physically or mentally, of and by the people taking care of you. This is often referred to as relational trauma. Psychological trauma. You felt overwhelmed, helpless, or afraid mentally. So, as you can see, whatever term you choose, what we're talking about is feeling overwhelmed, helpless, or afraid in some way at some point in your life, and not having anyone to help you make sense of it and put it into perspective. And that's all fine and good and all, but the problem is right now, every non-functional emotional moment or behavior in people's lives is being attributed to or called trauma or a trauma response. Even many normal physiological processes are being characterized as trauma responses right now. And there's a giant myth floating around out there that there is an emotional brain that overwhelms your rational brain in these so-called trauma responses. And another giant myth that your nervous system is always scanning for safety or danger. People are saying absurd things like recovering from trauma means getting your body feeling safe, as if there is one safe physiological state you can reach, which there isn't. And they're saying you have to release the trauma, which is meaningless because there is no specific physical process of releasing trauma. And frankly, it confuses people. They come to me using phrases like, I want to heal my trauma, or I want to release my childhood trauma, but they don't really have any idea what that means, which isn't their fault because it doesn't really mean anything, except that they've been indoctrinated into pop therapy language. And that's okay, because they're just grasping at straws for a way to say that they want their lives to feel better. They want to have better relationships, and they want to feel better in their own skin. They don't know why their lives don't feel better, and thank God for the current trauma narrative, because finally they have something to pin their troubles on. It's their trauma. It's not their fault that their life doesn't feel good. There's nothing wrong with them. It's that they've had past experiences, either acute or chronic, that felt overwhelming, and they have either never or insufficiently resolved those experiences, made sense of them. And therefore, aspects of how they moved forward from them are affecting their functioning today. And I'll say it again, because it's so important. It's not their fault. They're not crazy or neurotic. They don't have a mood or personality disorder. They just have trauma that they need to release. Hallelujah! A story that destigmatizes emotional difficulties and allows you to seek out therapy without shame? Finally! And that, dear viewer, is the value of the current trauma narrative. But it's the only value, because unfortunately, the current narrative also tells you a bunch of lies about how your body works and keeps you a victim. It keeps you believing that anytime you feel energetic arousal in your body, or if you float away from your body and dealing with stress, that you are having a trauma response. It makes you believe that you have emotional and primitive brains in your brain that can activate and overwhelm you any old time, and that you might have no idea when that might be. And it says that if you don't have a body-based therapist who's trauma-informed, you're not going to get the right help. Well, that's all nonsense. Because good old-fashioned psychodynamic psychotherapy is all about helping you unravel the myriad ways that unresolved, acute, and chronic, overwhelming past experiences are affecting your functioning today. That's what psychotherapy has always been about for 140 years, since the 1880s. It's not new. So while I can get behind the destigmatization of people's need for psychological help, I deeply disagree with the current trauma narrative. Yes, you are a product of your past, for better or for worse, but now, and every moment going forward, is a chance to seed your future with a different, more empowered past, leading you to a more empowered future. You may have, but you don't have to have had trauma. You don't have to release the trauma. You don't even have to believe that the body keeps the score, because it doesn't. You can just know that therapy is a place where you can discover and explore the thought and behavior patterns that were implanted in you by your early environments that got you to this moment, and practice new ones at a methodical and steady pace with someone who's an expert at that process. This is the work of all change, including trauma work. And anyone who tells you otherwise is selling you their therapy as if it's something different. It isn't, and it might keep you a victim. Choose wisely. And I'll see you next time.